The doctors walked out of the operating room and said 4 words no mother ever wants to hear. There is no hope. Not, we are trying. Not, we need more time. 4 words. Final. Cold. Delivered in a hospital corridor at 2:47 in the morning, under flickering fluorescent lights, to a woman sitting alone on a plastic chair, with nothing but a prayer mat folded in her lap. Her name was Maryam. She had traveled 6 hours to reach this hospital. She had signed forms she could barely read through her tears. She had watched nurses rush past her for 11 hours without making eye contact. And now, the lead surgeon, Dr. Harrison, a man with 30 years of experience, stood before her and said it. What happened next was not recorded in any medical journal. But every person inside that hospital that night will tell you the same thing. Something happened in that operating room the moment Maryam closed her eyes, opened her hands toward the ceiling, and began to pray. Stay with me. Because what you are about to hear will change the way you think about prayer forever. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand who Maryam was. She was not a woman of wealth. She lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, a neighborhood where the streetlights sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. She had raised 2 children alone after her husband passed away 14 years earlier from a heart condition the doctors had also, once, called hopeless. She had survived that too. Maryam worked 5 days a week at a laundry facility, folding other people's clothes from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Her hands were rough from years of hot water and detergent. But those same hands had memorized every word of Surah Al-Fatiha before she could read. Those same hands had been placed on her children's foreheads every night as she made dua for their protection. Her son, Yusuf, was 30 years old. A good man. He called his mother every morning without fail. He worked as a school administrator, coached a youth football team on Saturdays, and had recently gotten engaged. Then, 3 weeks ago, Yusuf collapsed at work. The scans came back. The diagnosis was the kind that makes a room go quiet. A rare and aggressive brain condition. Surgery was the only option, and even surgery, the doctors had warned, offered no guarantees. Maryam had listened to all of this, nodded, signed the papers, gone home, made wudu, prayed 2 rakats, and said to Allah, "You are Al-Shafi, the healer. I place my son in your hands." The surgery was scheduled for 8 o'clock in the evening. Maryam arrived at the hospital at 5. She brought a small bag, a change of clothes for Yusuf for when he woke up, a bottle of Zamzam water she had been saving for 2 years from a neighbor who had returned from Hajj, and her prayer mat. She sat in the waiting room and she watched the clock on the wall. The television in the corner was playing a news program she could not follow. A man next to her was eating chips from a crinkled bag. A child was crying somewhere down the hallway. At 8:15, the surgical team took Yusuf away. Maryam watched the double doors swing closed behind the gurney and she did not look away until the doors stopped moving. Then she opened her small bag, took out the prayer mat, found an empty corner of the waiting room, and she prayed Isha. She prayed slowly. Every word, every movement. When she reached the dua, she did not rush. She spoke to Allah the way a mother speaks to someone who she knows is listening, not with performance, not with desperation, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who has had this conversation before and knows it is never one-sided. The hours passed. 10 o'clock. 11. Midnight. 1 in the morning. A nurse named Sarah came to check on her twice. The second time, at around 1:30, Sarah sat down beside her and asked if she could get her anything, tea, water, something to eat. Maryam looked at her and said, softly, "Just pray with me, if you know how." Sarah did not know how. But she stayed anyway. Then, at 2:47, the doors opened. Dr. Harrison walked out. And he said the 4 words. Dr. Harrison was not a cruel man. Let that be said first. He had spent 30 years in operating rooms. He had delivered news like this before, terrible news, final news, and he had learned, over those 30 years, that the kindest thing you could do was to say it clearly. No softening. No false hope. Because false hope, he believed, only prolonged suffering. So he stood in that corridor and he said what he had come to say. And when he finished, he waited, as he always waited, for the response. Anger, usually. Sometimes screaming. Once, a man had tried to grab him. He waited. Maryam looked at him for a long moment. Her dark brown eyes were steady. Not empty, steady. There is a difference. She said, "Thank you, doctor. You have done your part. Now I will do mine." Dr. Harrison blinked. In 30 years, no one had ever said that to him. He did not know what to say back. He nodded, once, and turned to walk back toward the operating room, because despite everything, the surgery was not fully over. There were still procedures to complete, still the body of a young man to care for, even when the outcome seemed certain. Sarah, sitting beside Maryam, looked at her. She expected tears. She expected collapse. Instead, she watched Maryam reach into her bag, take out the prayer mat, walk to the center of the corridor, not the corner this time, but the center, lay it down on the cold linoleum floor, face southeast, and begin to pray. Not quietly this time. Audibly. Clearly. Her lips moving with words Sarah could not understand but somehow could feel in her chest. Allahu Akbar. The words moved down the empty corridor like a wave. Inside the operating room, the team was completing what they called closing procedures. When a surgery reaches the point of no return, when the outcome has been determined and the medical work shifts from saving to managing, there is a particular atmosphere that settles over an operating room. The urgency lifts. The voices get quieter. People move more slowly. The monitors continue their steady beeping, indifferent to human grief. Dr. Amina, the assistant surgeon, a quiet woman in her early 40s who wore a dark hijab beneath her surgical cap, was stitching with practiced, automatic hands when she heard it. At first she thought it was a sound from one of the machines. A frequency, almost. Then she realized it was coming from outside, from the corridor. A voice. A woman's voice, steady and low, reciting something she recognized immediately. She had grown up hearing those words. Her grandmother had recited them every morning of her life. She stopped stitching. The nurse across from her noticed. "Dr. Amina? Everything okay?" Dr. Amina did not answer right away. She was listening. Her eyes, above her surgical mask, had filled, quietly, without warning, with tears. And then something happened that no one in that room had expected. One of the monitors, the monitor tracking Yusuf's brain activity, changed. Not dramatically, not explosively. But measurably. The line that had been flat and slow began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. The anesthesiologist saw it first. He leaned forward. He looked at the screen. He looked at it again. "Dr. Harrison," he said quietly. "You should come look at this." Dr. Harrison stared at the monitor for 47 seconds. He counted later, he could not explain why he counted, only that the number stayed with him. The brain activity that had been declining, that had reached a point his entire team had agreed was irreversible, was responding. Slowly, incrementally, but unmistakably. Like something waking from a very deep sleep. He turned to Dr. Amina. "What changed?" he asked. "Did we adjust anything? Did someone change the medication?" Dr. Amina looked at him. Her eyes were still wet above her mask. She shook her head slowly. "Nothing changed, Dr. Harrison," she said. "Nothing that we did." He turned back to the monitor. He was a man of science. He had built his entire career on the premise that the human body was a system, complex, yes, but ultimately governed by laws that could be understood, predicted, and, when necessary, accepted. He did not believe in miracles. He believed in data. And the data in front of him right now did not make sense. He made a decision. "We're not closing," he said. "Everyone back to positions. We continue." For the first time in 3 hours, the operating room moved with urgency again. Out in the corridor, Maryam was in her third rocket. At 6:14 in the morning, the operating room doors opened. Maryam was still in the corridor. She had not slept. Sarah, the nurse, had brought her a cup of tea at some point and had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, still in her scrubs, her head tilted sideways, her breathing slow and even. Dr. Harrison walked out. He looked different than he had at 2:47. Something in his face had shifted, a man who had walked into a room certain of one thing and walked out certain of nothing, and found, to his own bewilderment, that the second state was not as frightening as he had expected. He stopped in front of Maryam. She was sitting upright, the prayer mat folded again in her lap, her dark eyes calm and waiting. He said, "Your son is stable." 3 words. The mirror image of the 4 words he had spoken 4 hours earlier. 3 words that, this time, reached her like water reaches dry ground. Her eyes closed. Just for a moment. Her lips moved, something quiet, something private. A word of gratitude that was not meant for Dr. Harrison, though he was standing right there. When she opened her eyes again, they were wet. But she was smiling. "Al-Shafi," she said quietly. "The healer." Dr. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that no one who was there that morning will ever forget, something that was not in any script, not in any bedside manner training, not in anything he had ever planned to say. "I think," he said slowly, "that whatever you were doing out here tonight, it worked." Yusuf woke up 14 hours later. The recovery was not without difficulty. There were follow-up procedures. There were medications and careful monitoring and many careful hours. But he woke up. He recognized faces. He spoke. He asked for his mother. Maryam was there when his eyes opened. She was holding his hand, her rough, worn, laboring hand wrapped around his. When he looked at her and said, "Mama," she leaned forward and placed her forehead against his forehead and stayed there for a long time, neither of them speaking. Dr. Harrison visited Yusuf's room on the second day. He stood at the end of the bed and reviewed the charts, and then he put the charts down and looked at Yusuf directly. He said, "You had a very strong advocate last night." Yusuf looked at his mother, then back at the doctor. "She always has," he said. Dr. Harrison nodded. He started to leave. At the door, he stopped. He turned back. He seemed to be searching for something, the right word, the right frame, some scientific category in which to place what he had witnessed. He did not find one. So he said the only thing left. Subhanallah. He did not know where the word came from. It had been 40 years since he had heard it, his grandmother on his mother's side had used it, a woman from a background he had long since stopped thinking about. But there it was, in his mouth, in a hospital room in the early morning, and it was the only word that fit. Maryam looked at him and smiled. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that. Now I want to talk to you directly. Because this is not just a story about one woman and one night and one operating room. This is a story about something that every one of us carries, and that many of us, in the busyness and difficulty of life, have begun to doubt. Dua works. Not because it follows our schedule. Not because Allah answers the way we expect or on the timeline we demand. But because dua is, at its core, an act of absolute trust. It is the moment when a human being acknowledges, I have done what I can do. You can do what I cannot. Maryam did not pray because she had given up. She prayed because she understood something that 30 years of medical training had not taught Dr. Harrison, that the outcome of that night was never entirely in human hands. The Prophet Muhammad said, Dua is worship. Not one kind of worship. Not a supplement to real action. Worship itself. The highest form of turning to Allah, because it requires the purest kind of surrender. And Allah, Al-Shafi, the healer, Al-Qadir, the all-powerful, does not turn away the hand that is raised to him. You may be watching this tonight because you are sitting in your own corridor. Your own waiting room. Your own impossible situation. Perhaps the doctors in your life, real doctors, or circumstances, or people who were supposed to help you, have said their version of those 4 words. Hear me when I say this, your story is not over. Make dua. Mean it. Trust the one who holds not just your situation, but every situation, in his hands. Sarah, the nurse who sat beside Maryam through that long night, later said something in a conversation with a colleague that found its way, as these things sometimes do, to the people who needed to hear it. She said, I have worked in this hospital for 6 years. I have seen recoveries I couldn't explain. But I have never seen anything like that night. I don't know what Maryam was saying. I couldn't understand the words. But I could feel it. It was like the whole corridor changed when she prayed. Like the air was different. Dr. Harrison, for his part, began visiting the hospital library. He requested books, history of religion, comparative theology, accounts of unexplained medical recoveries. His colleagues found it amusing. He didn't mind. He said, once, to a junior resident who asked him about it, I spent 30 years being certain. I think I can afford a few months of being curious. And Maryam? Maryam went back to work the following Monday. She folded other people's clothes from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. She called Yusuf every morning, as she always had. She prayed her 5 prayers, as she always had. She did not tell the story widely. She did not seek attention for it. When people who had heard about it asked her how she had stayed so calm through that night, how she had not broken, had not screamed, had not collapsed, she would think about it for a moment and then answer with the same words every time. I knew who I was talking to. That is the end of the story. And it is also the beginning of yours. If this touched your heart, say Alhamdulillah in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And do not forget, wherever you are, whatever corridor you are sitting in, you have access to the same thing Maryam had. A prayer mat. An open heart. And Allah, who is always listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.